Good evening. Good evening and welcome. March 28th, mark your calendars, is opening day of the 2024 Major League Baseball season. That is the day when all 30 teams will play. The Red Sox, however, will not be playing at Fenway Park. They'll be playing in Seattle with the Mariners. The first home game at Fenway Park is April 9th, when the Red Sox host the Orioles. This leads me into tonight's presentation. Matthew, in addition to being my neighbor, is an engineer and an historic building specialist who will share his passion for baseball and the architecture of baseball parks. Matthew, step up to the plate and hit it out of the park.
Thanks so much, Laurie. It's great to be here, and I really love these ballparks. I'm passionate about them, and I'm excited to share them with you today. So this is kind of a long arc for me. I was a kid growing up south of Boston. We went to games all the time at Fenway Park. We always sat in the bleachers. It was 75 cents when we started going. There were still benches. My dad was a public school teacher. We went with my uncle and my cousin Jack. He was a mailman, and it was just a great place to go. And I grew up there. And then later on, I went to engineering school and then went to get a graduate degree in historic preservation and had to pick a thesis topic and thought about, something that was not in any of my architectural history books and never would be. And so the question in my mind was really, how do we begin to understand these ballparks? They have such a fascination on the American public. What are they all about? How do they have architectural meaning? What is their architectural significance? So this talk kind of comes out of that came out of that question. So here we go. And this was many years ago. This was in the early 1990s. So what I'll cover tonight is really that question of how do we begin to understand them? How do we begin to understand their evolution and meaning within the culture? And you can tell these are kind of grad school questions, right? How do we situate these ballparks? And I'm talking about a very specific period of ballpark construction, of which Fenway is part, of 1909 to 1923, within the context of other eras of ballpark construction. How are they different than what came before them and what came after them? Conclusion, and then love to take your questions and answers and have some discussion. First of all, that big question, how do we begin to understand them? Again, they just don't appear in really any architectural history book that you will look at. I have many more. Here's a photo of a few of them. Well, we can talk about a lot of architecture as we do architecture here in Winchester in terms of some of these basics, the date, who was the designer, what style and period are they, what can we understand about their form, their plan, kind of how they're built and their construction technology, and really the tougher one. How do they begin to have meaning? And that's what architectural historians focus on the most, is how do sticks and bricks begin to convey meaning about a period or a culture, whether it's something that's not so long ago, whether it's a French Gothic cathedral, whether it's cave paintings. So let's start with the simple ones, date and designer. So here are the 14 ballparks that were built in this era. I call them the Major League ballparks, and by that I mean not only American League and National League, but also what was called and still called the Negro Leagues, and was recognized by Major League Baseball later as being a major league. So you see it's a very tight period of construction from 1909 up to 1915. Every year in that period, at least one park was built, and often more than one. And then there's kind of a big gap, about 8 years, and then you have Yankee Stadium. So most ballpark historians really consider Yankee Stadium part of this period. It's a little bit different from it, but it's almost the punctuation mark at the end of the era. It's bigger and grander than anything before, but it belongs in this period for other reasons that we'll get into a bit later. Also, when you notice the designers, the majority of these parks were built by the Osborne Engineering Company in Cleveland, Ohio. So I visited They're not built by, designed by the Osborne Engineering Company. And so as part of the research for the thesis, I went and visited their offices in Cleveland back when I was writing this, looked through their blueprints, which they still had for all these ballparks, interviewed the president of the company. It was just an amazing trip. So the architectural style and period, and this is maybe the most conventional way that an architectural historian might start to look at anything, is, well, what kind of quote-unquote style are they? And they're really all over the map. You know, Fenway Park is almost what some have called like neo-industrial, neo-Georgian. You know, it's just kind of a mix of early 20th century industrial architecture and really all different styles and periods. So this is Comiskey Park in the lower left in Chicago, that's Shive Field in Philadelphia, and Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, which you could maybe say that's Renaissance Revival. You could say this is almost French Second Empire. Maybe some arts and crafts influence here in the facade of Comiskey Park. So really no unifying tie stylistically in terms of conventional architectural styles between these ballparks. So what is it that unites them? What really kind of makes them a coherent group? So it's more when you start to look into the architectural form and plan. And what's really kind of unique about these is they were really shaped by their urban constraints and environments. So the outfield dimensions, which Fenway Park and really is famous for today, it was really typical of the period that the streets would really shape ballparks, tall walls, kind of juts and triangles, as you see here in center field. That's Griffith Stadium in Washington, D.C. Those were the norm, whereas Fenway today is the exception for those characteristics. They all had those types of characteristics. Construction technology. So the earlier predecessors were constructed of wood. That's the South End grounds in Boston, kind of a predecessor to Fenway Park. You can see these look like bandstands. They look like, something you might see in an early racetrack and that type of thing. And of course, their susceptibility to fire is what really led to this next generation of steel and concrete. So essentially fireproof construction, and then just the strength of steel and concrete making a whole different scale possible. You can see the difference in scale between this and this is Yankee Stadium here in the enlarged photo. And then the tough part, the meaning within the culture. So what is culture? Well, my thesis advisor really defined it this way. Culture is the shared beliefs, values, and ideals of a group of people. So it's really kind of a big idea. And my point here was really that things that have meaning within a culture, especially special meaning within a culture, tend to embody the ideas, beliefs, and values of that culture. So whether historians are looking at shards of Roman pottery, small things like that, or Greek pottery, or temples, any of those objects of cultural production begin to tell you something about the culture in which they were produced. So again, that's true whether you're talking about a French Northern Gothic cathedral, a really large structure, or whether we're talking about older, to us, but not nearly as old, structures here in the United States. So of course, Winchester Town Hall, and then this is the Fine Arts Library at Penn, where I wrote a lot of this thesis. So some odd similarities here stylistically, but these are both built shortly after the Civil War, and this is a period when the North is really kind of, puffing out its chest. They're feeling bold. They've won this war. Industry is really rolling up, and they're pretty kind of showy, broad, bright. The bright colors here, they're really kind of almost in your face. And even kind of simple vernacular buildings like older farmhouses and churches on the town green, and not just the building itself, but the way it's really situated within the landscape. The entire landscape of a town common, a town center in New England, really has meaning that relates to kind of the entire culture of early New England settlement. Great book on this I'd recommend. A number of books written by J.B. Jackson, the late J.B. Jackson. He taught at UMass Amherst and Harvard. And he was really a seminal figure in how to interpret vernacular landscapes like town greens and how they tell us something about the culture in which they arose. So, of course, in any culture, there are these places that have a really special meaning and that just capture the imagination of that people and that period and that place and time. And I would say that these ballparks are one of those special places. The ballparks of 1909 to 1923, there's just so much out there on them. There are so many books about Fenway Park and its sister parks from this period, and models and paintings that you can buy of Fenway and Ebbets Field, and kind of you name it, everything under the sun is available. So what is it about these ballparks, this period, that's so special? So Roger Kahn, a sports writer, writing in, I think it was early 1970s, 1984, wrote the following about Ebbets Field. He had grown up there, he had gone to a lot of games there, he had worked there as a sports writer, etc. So in an article in Sports Illustrated, 1984, Roger Kahn wrote the following about Ebbets Field. It was too small. The public urinals were fetid troughs. Its architecture suggested a mail-order tool shed. And every August, the grass began to die. Then work crews had to spray the outfield with green paint. There weren't enough seats, and the parking was impossible. When the Wreckers came in 1957, I felt no pangs. Walter O'Malley was a money man. The place was too damn small. Let it go. Let it go like the past. Now, through the years, it haunts me, like the fresh-faced, ardent girl you never married. Wow. So talk about having a lasting impact. But it's not just Kahn, it's just permeating the culture, the way these ballparks of this era have just had this incredible grip on people's hearts, minds, imagination. It's pretty staggering. So there's a lot there to unpack. How do we begin to understand why they've had such a strong grip on us through the years? How do we understand their meaning? So I'm going to kind of take it back a few steps and just start to look at baseball, then the way the game of baseball evolves, and then kind of come back to the ballpark. So we're starting with the really big picture of the game itself. So its evolution and development as a game, and how it evolves concurrently with the evolution of the United States. So you hear a lot of people say, well, baseball isn't really an American thing. It's this British game of rounders. It's a kid's game, et cetera. And that's partly true. So initially, the rules of rounders and baseball are identical. So early on, there are children's pocketbooks that have rules of different games and there are rules for rounders. This is from 1744. And this is played on a very, very small area. It's played with wooden stakes in the ground. Nothing happens very far away from a small group. You can almost think of something the size and scale of Foursquare, right? It's very confined, very defined, and it's a small game played by small children, as you see here. But it evolves a lot. All right, so here in America, it starts to become known as baseball or based. And this is an early illustration of children playing baseball on the Boston Common. So you can see it's starting to get a little more involved. We don't have stakes here. It's starting to spread out a little bit. So by the time you get to the 1850s, this is an 1857 illustration. You notice we have adults playing here. We actually have people watching. This looks more athletic. It's more spread out, right? It's no longer kind of a Foursquare-sized thing with kids trotting a couple feet to the next base. So it's a whole different game now. This is not anywhere near rounders by this point. And then with the Civil War, that's actually when baseball really spreads in popularity. Before that, it was pretty much a Northeast United States thing. And with soldiers traveling all up and down the coast, you really see it spread. So I believe this was Fort Pulaski, Georgia, with Union troops who were prisoners playing baseball in the background here in this photo. And then this is one of the earliest known photographs of a baseball game. This is from a Princeton yearbook in the 1800s. So how the game evolves in terms of American ideals, or how the game itself, the way the game is played, the rules of the game reflect American ideals. So it's an agrarian game. So there's no clock until recently. I have to amend this now. But it was really the only game where there's no clock. And it's really the farming season. It begins in the spring with planting, and it ends in the fall with harvest. The ideas of agrarian independence and self-sufficiency, so the players are sufficiently separated on the field that someone can't block for someone else, someone can't set a pick for someone else. They're kind of each responsible for their own actions, so the outcome of the collective good and the whole team depends on individual acts. So again, the players are separated, they're each responsible for their own area of land, and it's the only game where the defense has the ball. So the team in the field is always in control. The agrarians, the farmers, the fielders are always in control. And kind of unlike football or basketball, there isn't a specific size or body type that's valued here. You can be tall, you can be short, you can be hefty, you can be skinny. It doesn't really matter. It's just about skill and ability and effort that matter in baseball. So all these really kind of American ideals, democratic ideals, ideals of meritocracy. So how does the baseball field itself embody some of these American ideals? And in particular, how do they embody the notion of an American landscape in the 18th to 19th century? So as the game is evolving, as you saw in the earlier slides, how is the field evolving, and how does that relate to our notion of the American landscape? Whoop. A little help here. No? Seems like no is a good answer. All right, there we go. All right, so kind of an early conception of the American continent, relatively unknown, not very well known, not very well defined. This is from an early 1576 map, so this is before baseball. But we kind of see this as a vast continent of unknown wonders, awe, kind of untamed wilderness, and unbounded areas. And kind of this whole evolving ideal in the 19th century is to take that untamed wilderness and turn it into a garden of the new world. So this is peaceable kingdom. And kind of in concept, this idea is that we don't want to be these dense, overcrowded European cities. And we also don't want to be this just raw, untamed, dangerous wilderness. We want to find this kind of middle ground that's settled, but that's not too urban, right? So this notion of kind of a Jeffersonian agrarian democracy emerges, that the continent is tamed as a garden, well-ordered farms, everyone has kind of sufficient space, everyone's responsible for themselves. We're not an overcrowded city, and we're not this untamed wilderness. We're kind of a happy middle ground. And when you think about kind of the American continent in the early to mid-1800s, on the eastern seaboard, cities like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, there's a map of Boston in the upper right. It's very dense, very crowded, very small buildings that are very close together, narrow cobbled lanes, right? And then it starts to turn into farms in places like Winchester, Lexington, Concord. And then as you go out, it very quickly turns into very sparsely settled rural areas, and then kind of wilderness on beyond. And so this is kind of the continent. You go from that kind of dense city, but not quite the European city, not industrial, out to that middle landscape, and then all the way out to just this still kind of raw, untamed wilderness to the west. And so the field really starts to take on that characteristic. So in the infield, it's extremely well defined. Home plate's 17.5 inches wide. It's 60 feet 6 inches from home plate to the pitcher's mound. It's 127 feet to second base. It's very well defined and carefully ordered, and then it starts to turn into just anything as you get towards the outfield. So here's, again, that early illustration. I believe this one is from Currier and Ives. And you can see that we've got this well-ordered, where is grass, where is dirt, how far apart are these bases, how far apart is pitcher's mound. Then it starts to get out into a not quite as well-defined grass, and then it even just turns into wilderness beyond. So at this point, the fields are completely unbounded. You know, there's no outfield fence. And if someone were to hit a ball into those trees, an outfielder would run and the crowd would clear out of the way and would go try to catch it or chase it down and throw it back in. So there's no such thing as an automatic home run. And it's really the only sport where the field opens rather than encloses space. So it's the theoretically infinite extension of two perpendicular lines, right? Two 90-degree lines, the two follow lines. And anything between those lines is a fair ball. Those trees, those fans, anything else. As opposed to just kind of a rectangle, a basketball court, a tennis court, kind of a hockey rink, anything else that just encloses space on all four sides. So very different conceptually from all those other fields. And so here's our Ginn field. It's really that same concept, almost as you see in kind of Currier and Ives. So without the outfield fence there, if you hit the ball in the Aberjona, right, someone could go get it out real quickly, throw it in, and try to relay it home in time to play. So very similar to kind of these early illustrations, the unbounded field. And essentially this well-defined and manicured to semi-manicured to just wild to completely wild, right? And then in the 19th century, this notion also was really important. Again, kind of the dense European cities to the east, unbounded raw to the west. We also have this dichotomy between the pastoral and that agrarian virtue of the middle ground versus industrial technology that's starting to make its way to the United States. So kind of a big debate and dilemma arises. So we've defined ourselves, not only our landscape, but kind of ourselves and our democracy is based on this agrarian virtue, the middle ground. Thomas Jefferson famously wrote that our democracy was based on the virtue of farmers, because farmers were such virtuous people. Tilling the land, working the soil with your bare hands made you kind of honest and moral and all that. So if that's who we were, that's what we're all about, you can understand that this idea of America becoming this was just very disconcerting to a lot of people. What's going to become of our democracy? What kind of place are we going to be? How are we going to be responsible citizens, et cetera? So it's kind of an ongoing debate throughout the early 19th century. Really great example of this is Lowell, Massachusetts. So in order to even bring industry to the United States, there are huge debates about this. And a lot of it is couched in the idea that we've been creating this garden in the New World. That's been our task. That's what we're all about. This is simply yet another way of harnessing nature's bounty, God's bounty. They gave us these wonderful waterfalls. We're harnessing their power in places like Lowell, Lawrence, Rhode Island, and we're taking advantage of them to create this wonderful, cloth, this wonderful thread, and it's harnessing nature. And initially, these buildings are kind of small brick factories in this very rural landscape. It's kind of in line with the middle ground concept, but the cities of Lowell, Lawrence, Holyoke, et cetera, grow so quickly that they quickly become much more like the urban cities that we were trying to avoid in the first place, or that kind of were disconcerting to people at the time. So Lowell 1825 to Lowell 1840, it's a huge jump in just 15 years. So again, people are kind of worried about this, and a lot of authors have written about this. Leo Marx, who taught for many, many years at MIT, was eloquent about this. And kind of this idea, again, of the middle landscape, and kind of how do we bring the two together? How do we create that balance between kind of urban technology, but urban density and maybe some urban problems with completely rural system? And then you see 19th century landscape interventions and such as Frederick Law Olmsted's work, the Emerald Necklace shown here, that are trying to bring the two together in a sophisticated way. We're trying to weave together the rural and the urban. In this case, he's trying to reinsert nature into the heart of the city. So rather than finding that balance between the two, he's bringing nature back into the city, similar with Central Park in New York, Fairmount Park, other urban parks around the United States. And even with some developments, striving for this urban landscape, Forest Hills Garden, other designs by Olmsted and other landscape architects of the day. This is town of Chicopee, Georgia, designed by Earl Sumner Draper. Again, trying to work together kind of shared common green space, parkland, tree-lined streets with urban factories and urban development, so bringing the two together. And we see some wonderful examples here of kind of that ideal of a middle ground where you can appreciate both kind of nature and urban sophistication in one setting. So some shots at the top of the Boston Public Garden, and here Winchester Center. And so baseball, of course, is continuing to evolve, and the ballparks are continuing to evolve throughout this whole 19th century debate, early 20th century debate, and evolution of agrarian versus industrial, the virtue of the agrarian farmer, the kind of more rural baseball player symbolized by this painting, and then the game starting to transform as it is brought into the city. So look at this urban street scene. You see these kids playing baseball here in an alley. You know, wonderful photo, but it's also a very different idea of the game, right? They're playing in a very confined area. You know, we played in little back parking lots like this when I was a kid because I grew up right in a town center. And, you know, the game became a different thing where you set up ground rules, balls are bouncing off walls, it's double if it hits above the second story window, it's a triple if it's off the edge of the roof and that type of thing. So it becomes a whole different game that's rich in its own way as compared to the unbounded game, kind of the Ginn Field game, right? So the ballparks, these are kind of my categorization and other categorization of the different periods. So those pastoral ball fields like Elysian Fields and, you know, things akin to Ginn, pre-1862, the wood ballparks, which were really lovely but were very limited in size and very susceptible to fire. A few still survive, and you can see a few. There's one in Newport. There's one up in Marblehead. There's one in the Adirondacks I drove this summer. But many of them burned down. The classic urban ballparks, as they're often called, of 1909 to 1923 are focused today. Transitional ballparks, of which there were only a few built between the 30s and the mid-50s. And then the modern, so-called modern ballparks, 60 to 76. And the neo-traditional and high-tech ballpark is what I'm calling the period of 1990 to the present. So I'll kind of take them each in order here. The pastoral ballparks pre-1862, I've kind of told you about these, of course, completely unbounded. No outfield fence, very rural. The wooden ballparks, 1862 to 1908. Here's a better look at the South End grounds in Boston and others of this period. And this is early polo grounds in Manhattan before it was rebuilt. It was rebuilt and became one of the steel and concrete parks, the subject of our talk tonight. But this is the earlier wood version of the polo grounds in Manhattan. And again, here are urban kids playing a game that's becoming different and becoming interesting in its own right because of rebounds off walls and ricochets and things that everyone knows who's ever watched a game at Fenway Park can make it very interesting. So the urban ballparks of 1909 to 1923, here's our list again, all 14, many of them designed by the Osborne Engineering Company. And here are the characteristics of these. So again, industrial technology, steel and concrete that redefined and gave a whole new scale to the earlier pastoral ballpark. So steel trusses, upper decks, really above lower decks, kind of these light towers, lower deck, upper deck, roof. This is Forbes Field in Pittsburgh. And you see the scale that's possible here with steel and concrete. So the facades define the streetscape and became a part of the city as a nice piece of urban design. So again, Shive Field in Philadelphia. So these are really beautiful facades that were part of the streetscape. In the early 20th century, they weren't just kind of a bare structure and the backside of the stands. This is Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, kind of fitting that you have all this exposed steel lattice truss work in Steel City of Pittsburgh. And of course, Fenway Park and a lot of the tapestry brick that's still there today and you still appreciate today. And Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, one of my favorites. Wrigley Field in Chicago. And Comiskey Park in Chicago as well. Another characteristic is the proximity of the stands to the field. And a lot of people talk about this as intimacy. You know, is a ballpark intimate? Is an intimate place to watch a game? And what they really mean by that is how close are the fans to the field? And the whole idea here, so when I went to Osborne Engineering Company and rifled through their drawings and interviewed the president, he told me the whole idea of these ballparks, this is a section through Yankee Stadium, structural section, was get, get as many people as possible as close to the field as possible. So in terms of engineering technology, back then in the 19-teens, 1920s, we knew about the cantilever. We had the cantilever. They could have done cantilevers back then. That wasn't a new technology that came around in the 1960s. But by having some column supports here, you could get this entire upper deck much closer to the field than if you cantilevered part of it out. Most of it would be back here. So it was a very conscious decision that the most important thing is not to avoid any single obstructed view seat. The most important thing was get as many people as close as possible. And if you have a few obstructed view seats, that's a small price to pay for getting thousands of people closer to the field. So section through Yankee Stadium and the interests of Yankees-Dodgers rivalry, I will show Ebbets Field over here. And you can see in this photo, too, just how close that upper deck is to the field. It's almost directly above the edge of the lower deck. It's set just a little bit back. So here we go. This is Tiger Stadium. It was previously known as Briggs Stadium in Detroit. In this field, the upper deck in right field famously actually overhung the field. So if an outfielder were up against the fence in Tiger Stadium, the stands would be out over his head and extending a ways past the field. So if someone dropped popcorn out of the upper deck, it was actually on the grass in the outfield at Tiger Stadium. Here's another view of Tiger. Another characteristic, again, is the idiosyncratic geometry. So just the way they're shaped in a way that might look odd if you don't have a picture, if you just have a diagram of the field and you didn't see the streets around the field. But they were shaped by those urban constraints. So Crosley Field in Cincinnati, look at this field diagram. So very short home run to right and almost impossibly long home run to left center field. League Park in Cleveland. This one pretty short to right field here. Oops, wrong button. Pretty short to right field here, much longer to left field, very long to center field. Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, very short to right. And often the thing, as in Fenway, is you have a street here. It's so close. Not only do you have a close wall, but you have no stands, and then you have a very tall fence, right? Whereas over here on the left, where they had more room, you've got full stands, double deck all around, and then it kind of tapers to this skinny triangle in center as they run out of room for the stands to wrap around. Shibe Park in Philadelphia, kind of similar, the very deep center field as a result of the basically square Philadelphia street grid. And Sportsman's Park in St. Louis as well, so a short left field, deep right field with stands, short left field with minimal stands. And Yankee Stadium in the Bronx had an incredibly deep left center field. Even in the late stages before it was knocked down, it was still deep, but it was even deeper when they originally built it because, as you can see in this photo, they don't have the bullpens out here that were added later. So the fence was brought in. And if you ever watch games in the last 10, 15 years before they knocked down the old Yankee Stadium, if someone ever hit one all the way over the bullpen and all the way over the monuments and into the actual stands back here, that was a colossal clout. Originally, that was what it took to get a home run out of Yankee Stadium. Very, very deep drive to left center field, which is why they had so many great left-handed hitters through the years and not so many great right-handed hitters. They loaded up on left-handed hitters who had a short home run porch here in right field. And Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, again, really shaped how they had room for these stands in right field, but really not at all in left field. Hard to see in this photo, but there's a very tall brick wall here in left field with the street right behind. And that wall is still there, actually, today. It's on the campus of the University of Pittsburgh. So only a couple of these parks survive intact. Fenway, Wrigley, but a lot of them, there are fragments that you can see. Braves Field survives in part at Nickerson Field at Boston University today. Comiskey Park in Chicago, pretty close to symmetrical, but in the field. But you can see here on the left they had room for full stands, very deep in the upper deck, and over here on right they're kind of pared down to baby-sized stands by comparison. And again, Tiger Stadium in Detroit with the overhanging deck. Braves Field in Boston, and again, this in part survives today at Nickerson Field. A portion of these stands, I believe it's the right field corner here, that survives in part at Nickerson Field. And so you can see the railroad tracks here, skinny down, now run alongside the Mass Turnpike. So the Mass Turnpike is right about here, and then Commonwealth Avenue is right up here. So these large outfield walls, everyone knows the Green Monster in Fenway Park. It was not unique in this period at all. So many of the other parks had them for the exact same reason. There was a street right behind there. Not only didn't they have room for full stands, but they really needed a tall wall to kind of keep the ball in play and to protect the buildings across the street from constant broken windows. So you know left field and Fenway, here's a more recent view with the monster seats added. An earlier view. And this one is Griffith Stadium in Washington, D.C. That's one of my heroes, Josh Gibson, who hit, some estimate, 800 career home runs playing in the Negro Leagues his entire career, playing in Griffith Stadium in Washington, D.C. So you can see that actually if this really tall center field wall, this is what this is. So you can see there are a couple houses left here in center field that didn't sell when they were building this stadium. So what did they do but built that big wall right around them? So that's why it had a jut in center field, kind of the opposite of Fenway, which has the triangle poking out in center field. Griffith Stadium, there's that big jut. So imagine you live in the house right behind this big wall. So again, I feel like this incredible photo of the kids playing baseball in the alley, that's just the way the urban game comes in to enrich the game as we know it at Fenway. You know, the added element of balls caromming off a wall, someone trying to play a bounce, trying to turn and wheel and fire into second base in time to get a runner going for a double. So this image and this other painting down here of actually playing on a sand lot in New York City. I think that's the urban aspect of the game, enriching this traditionally or pastoral game through these ballparks for the first time. And a view of Ebbets Field in Brooklyn. So their tall right field fence was unusual in a couple different ways. So, of course, they had the scoreboard right in the middle of it. But you can see the first 10 feet or so of this wall were sloped backwards. And this was painted concrete. So if a ball hit here, it would bounce up. And because of the ball hitting something really hard like concrete, it would usually bounce up really high. Whereas if it hit this upper portion, which was clad with wood, it was a softer carom. And then this screen, unlike the screen at Fenway Park, this screen was in play. So it was more of a rigid screen like chain link. It wasn't a mesh net. And ball off that was in play. So a right fielder here had to look at three totally different caroms, one really hard, one kind of medium, and one a soft thud that just fell right down to the base of the wall, and judge in the air, where is it going to hit and where do I go to play it? So the Dodgers had some right fielders through the years that were really skilled at this. Opponents, no, not so much. They had a tough time with this wall. And occasionally, a ball would get stuck in that chain link that was in play. It became a ground rule double, and they had to get a huge ladder out in the middle of the game, and this worker would climb up there and pluck the ball out. So, world's most dangerous jobs. So in these urban ballparks, really the outfield can be both vast and tightly constrained. So with these walls, tightly constrained, caroms, kind of that urban element coming into the game at play. But in other areas, because some of those dimensions were so long, it could really be like that vast and kind of the earlier, kind of the Ginn Field and the Elysian Fields type thing, where someone runs a mile and catches a ball over their shoulder. This is Crosley Field in Cincinnati, and it had a literal landscape element incorporated into it. Some of the other parks did as well. Fenway Park did early in its life. So rather than a warning track that was flat but was a change in material from grass to gravel, the warning track in Crosley was a berm. So you can see it kind of banks up here. So if an outfielder's running back, looking over their shoulder at a ball, they know they're getting close to the wall because they start running uphill. So that's the warning track in Crosley. There were some others as well. This is actually Bo Jackson, and this is the Chattanooga Lookouts, a minor league stadium in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Had an earthen berm warning track until very recently. And this is the University of Texas at Austin. So this is where Roger Clemens played his college ball, and they literally had a limestone cliff across the outfield, but this is the outfield fence. So there was quite a bit of strategy with a power hitter of where you're going to play two fielders down here and one up here, where you're going to play all three down here. And if so, someone had to climb this cliff and scramble in time to try to prevent an inside the park home run. So talk about a tough outfield to play. Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, again, had the tall wall in left field, a bit hard to see here, and really this entire landscape beyond. And in a lot of these parks, the view out with the high stands behind home plate and between the foul lines and the lower stands also brought in views either of the landscape or of the city skyline beyond. So it starts to recall the landscape and the vast landscape even when it becomes bounded. And this is Sportsman's Park in St. Louis. I think this is really an incredible, just kind of realization of that notion that these foul lines extend theoretically infinitely. So they built the stands right up to that foul line. So the stands are essentially the foul pole in this stadium. They're what dictates fair or foul. Is it land in the stands, or is it clear past the stands in the sky? That's a fair or foul ball. And so that notion of kind of a vast, undefined outfield, so Polo Grounds is really a great example of both. So this was only 258 feet down the line. So that's a really easy home run. That's much shorter than any park currently in Major League Baseball. So 258 down the line. This center field wall, there's a recess back here. That center field wall is so far away, 483 feet. So almost 500 feet. It was never struck by a batted ball in all the years that baseball was played here. And the very famous, one of the most famous catches ever made by Willie Mays in the 1954 World Series, that was possible. You see that old film where the ball is hit and he just turns and is just sprinting, dead sprint, looks up at the last minute over his shoulder and catches it. A seemingly impossibly long run. That was possible only because this park is so deep to center field. He had basically a mile to run out there before catching that ball. So the very finite and the seemingly infinite in the same ballpark. So kind of the period that followed this, there was kind of a big lull, and then there were just a few stadia built in the 30s to the 50s. And so I love this painting. This is a painting of Milwaukee. County Stadium in Milwaukee, which is one of these transitional parks. This is in the 1950s when Milwaukee won the World Series, but it's one of those parks of that era. And they're more or less modeled on Yankee Stadium. They're on that vast, much grander scale, a really big upper deck, but they're really less shaped by those urban constraints. And that's the thing that kind of places them pretty squarely in their own category and not in the earlier category. So here's a view of Milwaukee. Then the modern, and Cleveland also, the old Cleveland Municipal Stadium fell into that category. and then the so-called modern stadia 1960 to 1976. So here, there's no longer an urban context. So these stadia were built either on the far edges of the city where it was just complete undeveloped land that no one cared about, or they were built way out in the suburbs. So it was just the idea that, all right, we're not going to put them in the city anymore. The idea of places like Fenway Park and Ebbets Field is we want to put them where public transportation is because we want as many people as possible to be able to get to the stadium, get to the ballpark, because that's how people traveled then, was on trolleys, right? And so the Dodgers, playing in Ebbets Field, the original name was the Trolley Dodgers because that was where 13 different trolley lines converged in Brooklyn at that site. That's what made it such a key strategic location to get people there to pack the park. So here we've got a totally different approach, totally different urban planning approach. It's almost anti-urban. It's we move this out to the edge of the city or to the suburbs. We build a huge parking lot around it, and so people can drive there and park. This is Dodger Stadium, built in 1960. Currently the third oldest park in Major League Baseball, believe it or not. Fenway and Wrigley from the earlier period, and then it's a huge jump, and third oldest is 1960. So this is Three Rivers Stadium in Pittsburgh. So at this point, not only are they kind of, so this is in the city, but again, a site that's really unconstrained by streets, right? They can build kind of an idealized form. And most of these stadia are really multi-purpose donuts, right? So they're kind of just a big ring, and they're football and baseball. They're no longer baseball specific. And a lot of them were basically kind of an idealized form that, you know, some have said, well, it was kind of inspired by the Roman Colosseum. And this is Philadelphia. So this is in the city, but obviously on a very large, kind of undeveloped parcel in South Philadelphia. I've actually been to this stadium many times. So when I was working on this thesis, this is the closest baseball stadium, so that's where I went. St. Louis here. You can see, again, in the city, but in a highway interchange, totally unshaped by urban streets. Hard to get there with anything other than a car. And one of the players of this era, Richie Hebner, who played for the Pittsburgh Pirates, said, you know, I stand at home plate in these stadia, and I can't tell which stadium I'm in. They all look the same to me. It's hard to tell them apart. So obviously, you're standing in home plate in Fenway, and you're standing in home plate in Wrigley. You always know what stadium you're in. Completely different look. They each have their own character. And the Astrodome in Houston, I think, was kind of the culmination in just completely subverting the pastoral with the urban technology, right? All elements of that pastoral park are gone. This is complete technology taking over. You know, a roof, we don't need natural grass anymore even. All hints are gone. And so in terms of watching a game at these stadiums, and in terms of the strategy of, you know, how do you seat people, what's the goal here? So again, Yankee Stadium, all the parks of 1909 to 1923, it's get as many people as possible, as close to the field as possible. Here's Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati, one of the donuts I just showed in the earlier photo. And the upper deck is above and behind the lower deck. Here's the lower deck. Here's the upper deck. Imagine you're a person sitting in the very last row of the upper deck, right? Here you are at Yankee Stadium. Here's the person, lowermost person in the lower deck. Here's the lowermost person in the lower deck in Riverfront. Here's the person in the last row of the upper deck. So you're a mile away from the field, kind of horizontally in this configuration. That's all to avoid a few obstructed view seats, or a relatively small percentage of obstructed view seats. So it's a totally different design strategy. So the current era of baseball stadiums, 1990 to present, again, I'd call it neo-traditional and high-tech. So both the kind of retractable roof genre stadiums, this one is Toronto, and you know many others built since then. That was one of the first. And this is an interesting photo. So this is old Comiskey and new Comiskey in Chicago. This is right around 1991. So I think this was even the very last game at Old Comiskey right here. So imagine, here's the upper deck. Imagine you're the last person here. And then here's the last person in the upper deck in New Comiskey. So it's a world of difference in the seating. And again, just the diagram again showing those two different design approaches. So Camden Yards in Baltimore, which I think is really, it was the first of the neo-traditional. I think it's still one of the best. Really great place to watch a game. As part of the research for this, you know, one of the other highlights, in addition to going to Osborne and going to Wrigley and going to Fenway and going to Tiger and some of the stadiums that are no longer there, and even some of the vestiges, went to what's left of League Park and Forbes Field and all this, but one of the highlights was going to Camden while they were building it. So I drove my tiny little beat-up Honda Civic onto what's now the field. It was just dirt then. They were building the stadiums around. Home plate was a stake in the ground. Contractors and the Orioles were nice enough to welcome me there, invite me in. I'd called ahead and kind of arranged this and show me what they were building and what they were doing. So again, still one of the best and well worth the visit. And we think about the warehouse in right field as being really unique, and today it is, but there are precedent for this. So this is actually in Boston. Cleveland, I think, you know, these are really getting into the high tech. A lot of them are kind of a fusion where you have some kind of high tech elements like these light towers, you know, a lot of silver metal and you know, kind of a lot of glitz and glamour skyboxes. But then you have some traditional elements, like they might have a throwback scoreboard or something like that. So kind of merging the two. And famously, when the Mets decided they were going to build a new stadium, they decided to model it on one of my favorites of this era, Ebbets Field. So here's a photo of Ebbets Field. Here's a New York Post article way back in the day saying the Mets are going to build a replica of Ebbets Field. And this was an early artist rendering. And, you know, here's Citi Field today. So they were doing their best to kind of bring back the charm of Ebbets Field. I don't think they quite got there, but they made an effort. So conclusions. So really I wanted to say that there's across, you know, the entire 18th and 19th century, there's this idea of what are we trying to create? How are we trying to build? How are we trying to settle and make our place on this, you know, on this continent? And this whole idea of a middle ground is a place where you can simultaneously enjoy the pastoral and the rural in close proximity to the urban context. So where you can enjoy the kind of beauty of the city and the beauties of nature and the pastoral simplicity together. So I think part of the reason that these ballparks have had such a strong grip on our hearts and minds for so long is because they were really one of the best realizations of that ideal that kind of gripped America for over 100 years. And itself is manifest in the game, and it was most manifest in the ballparks of this era. So thanks so much, and I'd love to take your questions. Yes.
I've only been in like a half a dozen, maybe more ballparks. Well, maybe about a dozen. Anyway, I know what the worst one I've been in. What's the worst one that you've been in?
I think the worst one I think the worst ballpark, but I've never been in it, is probably Tampa. But even watching a game there is painful to me. On TV, I can imagine it's even worse when you're there.
I agree.
Yeah.
That's my pick.
Okay.
What's your best?
I love Fenway. And, you know, I think there's a bit of a Fenway-Wrigley debate. I loved Wrigley too, but to me, Fenway is just, you know, just beautiful. And I think of the ones I visited, Tiger was also one of my favorite. You know, that's no longer standing, but, you know, and when I go to these games and visit a ballpark to really see it, I would move every inning or two to a different seat. So I'm seeing like lower deck, upper deck, moving all around. And of course I had to go sit in a seat right in the front row of the upper deck in right field where I could just look down and see grass under me and think about dropping a piece of popcorn onto the field, but I'm on TV, so I never did that. Yes.
What's the actual structural lifetime of a concrete and steel building? How long can the Fenway Park actually keep standing?
Yeah, well, it's, concrete and steel buildings. There are a lot of buildings that are much older than Fenway Park. Fenway Park's 1912 that are still going. Steel's a little easier to maintain because although it rusts, it's right out there. It's visible. There's a lot of scraping and painting, etc. Concrete's a little more insidious. So when the rebar inside the concrete starts to corrode, then it expands, it cracks the concrete. So you get into a lot of spall repairs, but they become part of the normal maintenance regime for not only for ballparks of that era, but there are a lot of buildings, high rises, mid rises, apartment buildings, college buildings in the Boston area that were built with steel and concrete construction 1912, 19 teens, around that time.
So with maintenance, with reasonable cost, it can just go forever?
Yeah, I think the thing that would probably eventually be the Achilles heel would be the parts you can't get to easily. So if you had really significant deterioration of footings or foundations, that can be the thing that can really end the life of any structure. So that's true of those steel and concrete structures, but it's also true of our older buildings that are on timber piles. Is if you lose the timber, you're really sitting on nothing. But, there are, Laura and I were just chatting earlier about some of the ancient Roman structures that were built of concrete. So, if you go to Rome and you see the Pantheon, there's a 2,000-year-old building built of concrete, or the Markets of Trajan, or some of those other buildings as well. So they can go a really long time if maintained. Yes?
How much were government involved in funding parks?
Oh, great question. So how much were government involved in funding parks? Really not at all. So the reason a lot of these fields like Ebbets Field or Comiskey Park have the name associated with them was the name of the owner who funded them and built them. So they were really private enterprise. There wasn't kind of public subsidy of these spaces, and even the land acquisition was all private. So Charles Ebbets had to secretly acquire all these little parcels and piece them all together and kind of not let on that he was buying up all these parcels and needed that entire block, right? And then when he finally got the last piece, he was able to build a stadium. There's a professor at Wellesley College who's really studied a lot of the economics of ballparks. So the kind of public funding and is really more of a modern twist on stadium construction of all kinds, not just baseball, but football, basketball arenas, etc. Yes?
Wasn't there a baseball field long before these at what's now Northeastern University?
Yes. Yeah, so Huntington Avenue grounds, and there were a couple. So Huntington Avenue grounds was the largest, and actually that's another field where there's a remnant. So the home plate from the Huntington Avenue grounds is in the lobby of one of the Northeastern buildings, and there's a statue of Cy Young near there as well. Yeah.
Wood construction?
Yeah, South End grounds was wood. Huntington Avenue grounds, part of that might have been steel. That was, but I would have to double back. I don't know Huntington Avenue grounds as well. And Fenway, when it was originally built, of course, all these ballparks really evolved over the course of their history. So when you saw those early photos, we talked about Fenway, but also Yankee, how that evolved. And Fenway was originally steel and concrete, kind of from first to third base, and then the outfield was wood when it was built in 1912. They had a really big fire, and then in 1934, and in 1934 they rebuilt the rest in steel and concrete. So it was originally kind of part wood, part steel and concrete. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what's up front on the chart.
Oh, yeah. So I mentioned Josh Gibson was a hero of mine, and so is Satchel Paige. So this Monarchs jersey is a Kansas City Monarchs jersey from 1945. Satchel Paige is another one of my heroes. And Satchel Paige and Jackie Robinson both played on the 1945 Kansas City Monarchs. So that's a team for the ages. And this brick is one of my proudest possessions. So. This is an original brick from Fenway Park, and in 1998, myself, my wife Erin, a bunch of our friends, we were among the founding members of a grassroots group, Save Fenway Park, that kind of rallied together to try to save the park, and petitions and bumper stickers and all that stuff. In 1998, when the Sox owners were threatening to tear it down and were seeking public funding, back to your question, to replace it and build a bigger replica, etc. And, we were not well treated in the press, I would say. So, I had a lot of conviction that this was really worth saving, and that it technically could be saved, as an engineer who works on old structures and historic buildings. And, we weren't treated very well at all. Bob Ryan called us a bunch of tree-hugging wussies in the Boston Globe for this ridiculously outlandish idea that Fenway Park did not need to be torn down. So we were publicly ridiculed by Bob Ryan, Dan Shaughnessy, others in the press in 1998. And how did that turn out? Anyone know? Is Fenway still standing? So the brick. So the owners were kind of lining up that public funding and trying to get a design in place and trying to make it look like they thought that new owners would see Fenway Park as a liability, and that to get the best price for selling that franchise, they would need to have a deal in place for a new ballpark. So that's what they were really working on. So when they sold the ballpark, they had a number of teams that wanted, a number of buyers, potential buyers, teamed up who wanted to buy it. And out of the many teams that kind of lined up and wanted to buy the Red Sox, there was only one group that said, we want to keep the ballpark. And that was the group that got the park. So that was Larry Lucchino, Werner, and the group that currently owns the team. So they bought it. They brought in Janet Marie Smith. Janet Marie Smith was the architect of Camden Yards in Baltimore. She really appreciated and understood the virtues of these traditional urban parks of that era. Fenway and Ebbets had kind of been models for what she was trying to build and what they were trying to build in Baltimore with Camden Yards. So the architect of that stadium was HOK, who built a lot of the earlier stadiums. But Janet Marie Smith was like the owner's architect, and she was a really incredible driving force and influence on what they were building there, keeping the warehouse kind of a traditional scheme, an irregular field, a downtown location, just everything that made the ballparks like Fenway and Ebbets great. She really pushed to get that at Camden, and it's right downtown. It's right near Inner Harbor. It's right near that B&O warehouse. So I think they really succeeded. I think it's a great park. And she went on to do other great things as well. So she did great things with renovating Fenway, improving it, dealing with a lot of the space constraints, adding seats, adding concessions, et cetera, and making it much more accommodating today, a much more comfortable place today to watch a game. And then she went on and did some great things at Wrigley Field, and she currently works for the Dodgers. Actually, I think she recently moved on from the Dodgers and on her own, but she did a lot for renovating Dodger Stadium as well. So she's been an incredible kind of influence on ballpark design and renovation in the past 20 years.
So how'd you get the brick?
So, yeah. How did I get the brick? So after all that public ridicule and scorn, but sticking to my guns and what I really thought could be done professionally and ethically, I thought, needed to be done, what I thought was important for saving this for my kids and their kids and all. 10 years later, the Red Sox presented the founding members of Fenway Park, including me, with this brick with a little plaque on it that said, Save Fenway Park, 10 years of work, generations of reward, thank you. And they had a reception for us at Fenway Park.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That
Thanks
was
for having
wonderful.
me.